Hashtag the judge tried to auction an orphan bride, and the highest bidder sent him to the gallows. The last light of day slipped through the courthouse windows, painting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Judge Monroe brought the gavel down with a crack that silenced the murmuring crowd. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, scanned the faces of the townsfolk who'd gathered for what he'd called a special proceeding. As executor of the Wallace estate, he announced, voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands, I present the final asset for consideration. A side door opened. 2 women ushered in a girl no older than 16, dressed in a simple blue dress that hung loose on her thin frame. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that might have been pretty if not for the hollow look in her eyes. Miss Eliza Wallace, Judge Monroe continued, daughter of the late Thomas and Mary Wallace, now ward of the county. Given the unusual circumstances of her father's deaths, and in accordance with territorial statutes regarding orphans without means, I opened bidding for her hand in marriage at $50. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few men looked away. Others leaned forward. In the back corner, partially hidden by shadow, stood a man the town knew only as Blackwood. His eyes never left the judge as he raised a single finger. 100, Blackwood said, his voice carrying without effort. The judge's face betrayed nothing, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight relief in his shoulders. $100, Monroe repeated. Do I hear 120? The girl stared at the floor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. No one spoke. The judge's gavel fell again. Sold to Mr. Blackwood. What no one in that courtroom realized was that the sound wasn't just the closing of an auction. It was the first nail in Judge Monroe's coffin. Dust devils danced across the main street of Bitter Creek, a town that had sprung up around silver mines that promised wealth but delivered just enough to keep men hoping. The single thoroughfare was lined with the usual establishments, a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a small bank, and the courthouse that also served as Judge Monroe's residence. Eliza Wallace had lived in Bitter Creek her entire life. Until 3 weeks ago, she'd been the daughter of the town doctor, a man respected for his skill and kindness. Now she was just another orphan, the one with a particularly cruel story. The fever had taken her mother 2 years earlier. Her father had managed to hold their world together until the night he'd been called to deliver a baby at a farm 10 miles out. They found his body the next morning, his horse shot dead beside him, his medical bag emptied of the morphine and money he'd been carrying. What Eliza didn't know then was that her father had borrowed heavily from Judge Monroe to keep their home after her mother's illness. The judge had been patient while the doctor was alive. That patience died with Thomas Wallace. Judge Harlan Monroe had once been considered a fair man, perhaps even a good one. 20 years on the bench had hardened him, and the last 5 had corrupted him completely. The silver that flowed through Bitter Creek had a way of finding its way into his pockets, from mining disputes settled in favor of whoever paid more, to criminal cases that mysteriously disappeared. His weakness was cards. Every month, he traveled to the larger settlement of Providence, where he lost more than he could afford to men who made sure he kept coming back. His debts had grown beyond his ability to pay, and the men he owed weren't known for their understanding. Eliza spent the days after her father's funeral in a daze, moving through the rooms of their small house like a ghost. Neighbors brought food she couldn't eat. The Reverend's wife offered platitudes that meant nothing. When Judge Monroe appeared at her door with papers declaring himself executor of her father's estate, she signed without reading. 3 days later, everything in the house was sold. The next morning, she was taken to a room above the courthouse and told to wait. The evening before the auction, a black carriage pulled by 4 matching horses rolled into Bitter Creek. The driver, a man with a face like weathered leather, didn't speak as he secured the team outside the hotel. The passenger who emerged stood for a moment, taking in the town with eyes that missed nothing. Edward Blackwood was known throughout the territory, though few could claim to know him. His land holdings stretched across 3 counties, his cattle numbered in the thousands, and the rumors about how he'd acquired his wealth were as varied as they were dark. Some said he'd struck gold in the mountains and killed his partners. Others claimed he'd been a hired gun who saved his money and invested wisely. All agreed on one thing: he was not a man to cross. He took a room at the hotel but didn't retire to it. Instead, he made his way to the saloon, where he occupied a corner table and ordered whiskey he didn't drink. He listened more than he spoke, gathering the threads of conversation around him like a spider collecting strands for a web. Heard the judge is holding some kind of special auction tomorrow, a miner said to his companion. Ain't natural, what he's doing, the other man replied, lowering his voice. Wallace was a good man. His girl deserves better. You know Monroe's in deep with those Providence boys. Guess he's desperate. Blackwood's expression never changed, but something in his eyes shifted, like ice cracking beneath the surface of a frozen lake. Across town, Eliza sat on a narrow bed, watching moonlight crawl across the floorboards. She'd heard the whispers from the women who brought her meals. She understood what tomorrow would bring. There were stories of such things happening in remote places, orphan girls with no family to protect them, sold under the thin disguise of marriage arrangements. She considered running, but where would she go? The wilderness beyond town was unforgiving, and she had no money, no horse, no supplies. The weight of her situation pressed down on her until it was hard to breathe. I won't cry, she whispered to the empty room. Whatever happens, I won't give them the satisfaction. Morning came too quickly. The women who'd been assigned to prepare her arrived with a blue dress that had belonged to someone else and instructions to make herself presentable. They weren't unkind, but their eyes held pity that burned worse than contempt. There's talk that Blackwood's in town, one whispered as she helped Eliza with her hair. If he's at the auction. She didn't finish the thought. Who is he? Eliza asked. A man who gets what he wants, the woman replied. And God help anyone who stands in his way. Hours later, as she stood before the crowd in the courthouse, Eliza understood the woman's warning. Blackwood's bid silenced the room. The speed with which the judge accepted it confirmed what many suspected. This wasn't an auction at all, but a transaction already arranged. As the gavel fell, Eliza raised her eyes to meet Blackwood's for the first time. She expected to see triumph or desire. Instead, she found something colder and more focused, calculation. She didn't understand then that she wasn't the prize he'd come for. She was merely the key that would unlock his true purpose. The Blackwood estate stood 15 miles outside of Bitter Creek, a sprawling ranch house built of stone and timber that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. The journey from town passed in silence, Eliza and Blackwood seated across from each other in the carriage, two strangers bound by a transaction neither fully understood. You'll have your own rooms, he said as they approached the house. They were the first words he'd spoken directly to her. Mrs. Caldwell manages the household. She'll see to your needs. Eliza nodded, unable to find her voice. The reality of her situation was beginning to settle around her like a shroud. She was now, in the eyes of the law and society, Mrs. Edward Blackwood. The thought made her stomach turn. The house was as imposing inside as out. High ceilings, expensive furnishings, everything speaking of wealth and power. Mrs. Caldwell, a stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair, greeted them at the door. I've prepared the east room, sir, she said, her eyes flickering briefly to Eliza. Show Mrs. Blackwood upstairs, he replied. I'll be in my study. Eliza followed the housekeeper up a broad staircase, down a hallway lined with closed doors, to a room at the far end. It was larger than any bedroom she'd ever occupied, with a four-poster bed, a dressing table, and windows that looked out over rolling grasslands. Your things will be brought up, Mrs. Caldwell said, though they both knew Eliza had nothing but the clothes she wore. Dinner is at 7. Mr. Blackwood expects punctuality. Left alone, Eliza moved to the window. From this height, she could see for miles, the ranch buildings, cattle and distant pastures, and beyond them, the mountains that marked the edge of Blackwood's domain. It was beautiful in its way, but all she could think was how far she was from anything familiar. A soft knock at the door startled her. A young woman entered, carrying a tray. Mrs. Caldwell thought you might want tea, ma'am, she said. I'm Jenny. I help with the housekeeping. Thank you, Eliza replied, suddenly aware of how dry her throat was. And please, call me Eliza. Jenny looked uncertain. Mrs. Caldwell wouldn't like that. Is she very strict? She runs a tight house, Jenny said carefully. But she's fair. Been with Mr. Blackwood for years. Eliza wanted to ask more about Blackwood, about what was expected of her, but something in Jenny's manner suggested caution. The dresses in the wardrobe should fit you, Jenny continued, nodding toward a large oak cabinet. Mrs. Caldwell had them made up when Mr. Blackwood sent word you'd be coming. The implication of those words hung in the air. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision. Blackwood had planned this, had known about the auction before it happened. After Jenny left, Eliza opened the wardrobe to find half a dozen dresses, all well-made but simple. No wedding gown, no fine evening wear. These were practical clothes for a woman expected to run a household, not for a wife who would be shown off to society. She changed for dinner, choosing the plainest of the dresses, and made her way downstairs at precisely 7 o'clock. Blackwood was already seated at the head of a table that could have accommodated 20. He gestured to the place setting at the opposite end. I trust the room is satisfactory, he said as she sat. Yes, thank you. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too small, too timid. Servants brought soup, then roast beef, then dessert. Blackwood ate methodically, asking occasional questions about her preferences. Did she ride? Could she read? Was she familiar with household accounts? She answered as honestly as she could, waiting for him to address the real question between them, but he never did. When the meal ended, he stood. I have business to attend to. Mrs. Caldwell will show you the house tomorrow. He left without another word, and Eliza realized he hadn't once called her by name. To him, she wasn't Eliza or even Mrs. Blackwood. She was simply a piece moved into place for reasons she couldn't fathom. That night, alone in her new bed, she finally allowed herself to cry, not for what had happened, but for what hadn't. There had been no violence, no cruelty, just a cold indifference that was somehow worse. At least with cruelty, there would be something to fight against. This emptiness offered no purchase for resistance. The days that followed established a pattern. Blackwood was often absent, riding out early and returning late. When he was home, their interactions were minimal and formal. He never entered her room, never made any demands of her as a wife. She ate her meals alone more often than not, spent her days learning the house under Mrs. Caldwell's watchful eye, and tried to understand what purpose she served. The household staff treated her with a cautious respect that bordered on wariness. They answered her questions about daily operations but fell silent when she asked about Blackwood himself. It was as if a wall had been built around certain subjects, and no one dared breach it. A week after her arrival, Eliza found herself in the library, running her fingers along book spines that hadn't been touched in years. The collection was impressive: literature, history, law, science, all meticulously organized but gathering dust. He doesn't read much anymore, Mrs. Caldwell said from the doorway, making Eliza jump. Not since Mrs. Blackwood passed. Eliza turned, startled. Mrs. Blackwood? The housekeeper's face closed like a shutter. That was thoughtless of me. I shouldn't have mentioned her. Please, Eliza said, stepping forward. I didn't know he was married before. Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, then sighed. It was long ago, before he built this place. She died in childbirth, both her and the baby. He doesn't speak of it. The revelation shifted something in Eliza's understanding. Blackwood wasn't just a wealthy man who'd purchased a wife for unknown reasons. He was a widower who'd lost not only a spouse but a child. What was her name? She asked. Catherine, Mrs. Caldwell replied, and for a moment, her stern face softened. She was a gentle soul. Too gentle for frontier life, perhaps. Before Eliza could ask more, the housekeeper straightened, her professional manner returning. Mr. Blackwood will be dining in town tonight. You're free to take your evening meal whenever you wish. As Mrs. Caldwell left, Eliza turned back to the bookshelves, seeing them with new eyes. Had these been Catherine's books? Was this library created for her? The house suddenly felt different, not just a wealthy man's showplace, but a memorial to someone loved and lost. That evening, with Blackwood away and the house quiet, Eliza found herself drawn to the West Wing, an area Mrs. Caldwell had politely but firmly indicated was not part of her domain. The corridor was dimly lit, the rooms clearly unused. At the end was a door, heavier than the others, its brass handle tarnished from lack of use. She hesitated, knowing she was crossing a boundary, but the need to understand the man whose name she now bore outweighed her caution. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was a study, larger and more personal than the formal one Blackwood used downstairs. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface covered with papers. Bookshelves lined the walls, but unlike the library, these volumes showed signs of use. A portrait hung above the fireplace, a young woman with fair hair and gentle eyes that seemed to follow Eliza as she moved through the room. Catherine, she thought. It had to be. On the desk lay an open journal, the handwriting bold and angular. Eliza knew she should leave, that reading another's private thoughts was unforgivable, but a name caught her eye: Monroe. She moved closer, tilting the page to catch the lamplight from the hallway. Monroe continues to delay the proceedings, the entry read. Claims the documents are insufficient. 3 years of searching, all the evidence laid before him, and still he obstructs justice. Today he suggested that perhaps financial considerations might expedite matters. The man's corruption knows no bounds. The entry was dated 6 months earlier. Eliza turned the page, her heart racing. Confirmation today of what I've long suspected. Monroe is in league with them. The same men who destroyed my family now line his pockets. Providence is no longer just a town. It's the center of their operation. The judge is their puppet, dancing to whatever tune pays most handsomely. She flipped forward, scanning entries that detailed Blackwood's investigation into some connection between Judgment Row and men in Providence. The most recent entry, dated just before their marriage, chilled her blood. Monroe has overplayed his hand. His debts have made him desperate. Word has reached me of his plan to auction the Wallace girl, a final disgrace that may prove his undoing. The pieces are in place. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Eliza stepped back from the desk, her mind racing. She wasn't simply a convenient solution to Blackwood's need for a housekeeper or even a wife. She was part of some larger plan involving the judge, a plan years in the making. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. She turned to find Blackwood standing in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. "I see you found my private study," he said, his voice level. Eliza lifted her chin, refusing to show fear. "And I see you've been using me as a pawn in whatever game you're playing with Judge Monroe." For the first time since she'd met him, something like respect flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "Not a pawn, Miss Wallace," he replied. "A witness." Blackwood didn't order her from the room as she expected. Instead, he lit the lamps, closed the door, and gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. He remained standing, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. 15 years ago, he began, I was not Edward Blackwood. I was Eddie Black, son of a miner who'd struck a modest vein of silver in the hills above Providence. Not enough to make us rich, but enough to build a future." His voice was steady, but Eliza could sense the control it required. "My father was an honest man. When he discovered that his claim overlapped with land already registered to the Providence Mining Company, he went to the county seat to sort it out legally. Judge Monroe was new to the bench then. He ruled in favor of the company, despite clear evidence that their claim had been filed after my father's." Blackwood moved to the window, looking out at the darkness as if seeing into the past. "My father appealed. 3 days later, our cabin burned to the ground with my mother inside. The sheriff called it a tragic accident. When my father protested, he was found hanging from a tree the next morning. Suicide, they said. A man overcome by grief." He turned back to face Eliza, his eyes hard. "I was 14 years old. No family, no home, no claim. The same judge who ruled against my father declared me a ward of the county and sent me to work in the very mine that should have been ours." Eliza sat very still, the pieces beginning to fit together. "And you believe Judge Monroe was involved in your parents' deaths?" "I know he was," Blackwood replied. "It took me years to gather the proof. By then, I'd changed my name, built my fortune, become someone with enough power to seek justice. 3 years ago, I brought my evidence to the territorial court. The case was assigned to Judge Monroe." "Who buried it?" Eliza said, understanding dawning. Blackwood nodded. "The Providence Mining Company has become the Providence Consortium. They control not just the mines but the banks, the shipping contracts, even the railroad spur. And they control Monroe, just as they did 15 years ago." "What does this have to do with me?" Eliza asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Your father was an honest man too," Blackwood said. "He treated miners injured in accidents the company preferred to keep quiet. He kept records, dates, names, types of injuries inconsistent with the official reports. The consortium couldn't risk him talking." A cold certainty settled in Eliza's chest. "They killed him." "Yes. And Monroe knew it would happen. He'd been warning the consortium about your father for months." Eliza's hands clenched in her lap, anger burning through her shock. "How do you know all this?" "I have sources inside their organization. People who've seen what I've seen and want it to end." He moved to the desk and lifted a stack of papers. "Witness statements. Financial records showing payments from the consortium to Monroe. Your father's medical logs, which I recovered before they could be destroyed." "And me?" Eliza asked. "Where do I fit in this plan of yours?" Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "You were never supposed to be auctioned like cattle. That was Monroe's desperation. My intention was to approach you privately, offer you safety and the chance to help bring your father's killers to justice." "By marrying me?" The skepticism in her voice was clear. "By giving you my protection," he corrected. "The marriage was an adaptation to circumstances. The fastest way to remove you from Monroe's control." Eliza stood, needing to move, to process what she was hearing. "So what happens now?" "You use these papers to expose the judge. Now," Blackwood said, "we wait for Monroe to make his final mistake. The territorial governor arrives next week for his annual inspection. Monroe doesn't know that the governor already has copies of most of these documents. He's waiting for one last piece of evidence before acting." "What evidence?" Testimony from someone Monroe has personally wronged. Someone whose story is beyond reproach. His eyes held hers. You. Eliza turned away, moving to the portrait of Catherine. The woman's gentle eyes seemed to offer understanding. She wasn't your wife, was she? Eliza asked suddenly. Blackwood was silent for a moment. My sister, he finally said. She died trying to find help after our cabin burned. I found her body on the trail to town. His voice had gone flat, as if the only way to speak of it was to drain all emotion from the words. Eliza faced him again. If I do this, if I testify against Monroe, what happens to our arrangement? That would be your choice, he replied. The marriage could be annulled. You would have enough money to go wherever you wished, start a new life. Or you could stay, not as part of some plan or strategy, just as yourself. The offer hung between them, not a declaration of feeling, but something more honest. A possibility. I need time to think, she said. Blackwood nodded. Take all the time you need. But know this, with or without your testimony, Monroe will face justice for what he's done. To my family. To yours. To how many others we may never know about. As Eliza left the study, she felt as if she were walking away from one life and toward another, though which path led where, she couldn't yet tell. The days leading up to the governor's visit passed in a strange limbo. Blackwood no longer maintained the formal distance he'd established, but neither did he press Eliza for a decision. They took meals together, spoke of books and music, carefully avoiding the choice that loomed before them. Eliza found herself studying him when he wasn't aware, the way his stern expression softened when speaking to the ranch hand's children, how he always thanked the servants by name, the care he took with his horses. He was not a warm man, not given to easy smiles or light conversation, but there was a steadiness to him that she began to find comforting. For days before the governor was due to arrive, Blackwood announced he needed to ride into Bitter Creek. There's a shipment at the general store, he explained over breakfast. Things for the house. Eliza nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. He was giving her space to consider her decision without his presence influencing her. Will you be gone long? She asked. Just the day. I'll return by nightfall. After he left, Eliza wandered the house restlessly. Mrs. Caldwell watched her with knowing eyes but said nothing. By mid-afternoon, Eliza found herself back in Blackwood's study, drawn to the evidence of his long pursuit of justice. She sat at his desk, reading through the documents he'd gathered. Witness statements from miners who'd seen company men near the black cabin the night it burned. Bank records showing deposits to Monroe's account that coincided with favorable rulings. A sworn affidavit from a former Providence Consortium guard detailing orders to silence Thomas Wallace. Her father's medical logs were there too, his familiar handwriting noting injuries inconsistent with reported accidents. Crushing wound to right hand, not possible from described rockfall. Burns on back, suggests facing away from blast, contradicts foreman's report. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about Blackwood's family or hers. It was about a system of corruption that had destroyed countless lives, a cancer that had spread through the territory unchecked for years. Her decision crystallized. She would testify. Not for Blackwood, not even for her father, but because it was right. The sound of horses approaching pulled her from her thoughts. Too many horses for just Blackwood returning. She moved to the window and felt her blood freeze. Judge Monroe sat astride a bay gelding, flanked by 4 men she didn't recognize. Behind them, Blackwood's hands were tied to his saddle horn, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Eliza ran from the study, down the stairs, reaching the front door just as Mrs. Caldwell opened it. The housekeeper's face was pale but composed. Get to the back of the house, she whispered urgently. Take the cellar stairs down and out through the root cellar. Jenny will show you. I won't run, Eliza replied, stepping past her onto the porch. Judge Monroe's smile didn't reach his eyes as he dismounted. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, tipping his hat. I'm afraid I bring troubling news. Your husband has been arrested for the murder of Thomas Wallace. Eliza's shock wasn't feigned. That's absurd. Nevertheless, we have a witness who places Mr. Blackwood near your father's body the night he was killed. Monroe gestured, and his men cut Blackwood from his horse. We'll be taking him to Bitter Creek to await trial. Blackwood's eyes met Eliza's, a warning in them she understood immediately. They'd moved sooner than expected, fabricating charges to silence him before the governor arrived. I'd like a moment with my husband, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Monroe hesitated, then nodded. Make it brief. The men shoved Blackwood toward her. When he was close enough, she reached up as if to touch his face, using the gesture to whisper, the study. Top drawer. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, then said aloud, "Don't worry. This is a misunderstanding that will be cleared up quickly." As they led him back to the horses, Monroe lingered, studying Eliza with calculating eyes. "It's a shame, really. A young woman like you, tied to a man with such dark secrets." "The only shame," Eliza replied coldly, "is that you continue to breathe the same air as decent people." Monroe's face hardened. "Be careful, Mrs. Blackwood. Your husband isn't the only one who could face charges." He mounted his horse and signaled to his men. As they rode away with Blackwood, Eliza turned to Mrs. Caldwell, who stood in the doorway. "We need to move quickly," she said. "Is there a horse I can ride?" The housekeeper nodded. "I'll have one saddled." "What are you planning?" "Something dangerous," Eliza admitted. "I need to get to the governor before Monroe can do whatever he's planning." While Mrs. Caldwell gave orders to the stable hand, Eliza returned to Blackwood's study. The top drawer of his desk contained a sealed envelope addressed to Governor Harrison, and beneath it, a revolver. She took both. 20 minutes later, she was galloping toward the territorial capital, taking a route Blackwood had once mentioned that would bypass Bitter Creek entirely. The governor would be traveling the main road from the east. If she pushed hard, she might intercept him before he reached the town. Night was falling as she crested a ridge and saw the dust of an approaching party on the road below. She urged her horse down the slope, waving her arm to attract attention. The lead riders, seeing a woman alone, signaled the group to halt. "Please," she called as she approached, "I need to speak with Governor Harrison. It's a matter of life and death." A distinguished man with silver at his temples moved his horse forward. "I'm Harrison." "Who are you, young lady?" "Eliza Wallace Blackwood," she replied, catching her breath. "My husband has been arrested on false charges by Judge Monroe. I have evidence of corruption that the judge is trying to suppress." The governor's eyes narrowed. "Blackwood? The man who's been corresponding with my office about the Providence Consortium?" "Yes, sir. Judge Monroe took him this afternoon. I believe they mean to kill him before you can review the evidence." Harrison turned to his escort. "Major, take 4 men and ride ahead to Bitter Creek. Secure the jail and ensure no harm comes to the prisoner." As the soldiers departed, he looked back to Eliza. "Now, Mrs. Blackwood, let me see this evidence." She handed him the envelope. As he read through the documents, his expression grew increasingly grave. "This is more serious than I realized," he said finally. "If even half of these allegations are true, we're looking at corruption on a scale I've never seen." "Every word is true," Eliza said. "And I can testify to Monroe's actions myself. He auctioned me like property to pay my father's supposed debts after arranging my father's murder." The governor closed the envelope. "We'll ride for Bitter Creek immediately. If Judge Monroe has harmed your husband, he'll hang for it." They reached Bitter Creek just before midnight to find the town in an uproar. A crowd had gathered outside the jail, held back by the governor's soldiers. Inside, Blackwood sat in a cell, bruised but alive. Judge Monroe was nowhere to be found. He ordered his deputy to execute the prisoner for attempting escape. Major Davis reported to the governor. When we arrived, the deputy was already unlocking the cell with his pistol drawn. Monroe fled when he heard we were coming. Governor Harrison wasted no time. He called an emergency session in the courthouse, deputized trustworthy citizens, and sent riders to alert neighboring towns. By dawn, a formal investigation was underway, with Eliza's testimony as its cornerstone. She spoke for over an hour, detailing everything from her father's death to the auction to what she'd learned from Blackwood's evidence. When she finished, the governor asked a single question. "Mrs. Blackwood, do you believe your marriage was entered into under false pretenses?" Eliza glanced at Blackwood, who sat quietly at the back of the room. "No, sir. Unusual circumstances, perhaps, but not false pretenses." The investigation expanded over the next 3 days. Former employees of the Providence Consortium came forward with new testimony. Bank records were seized, revealing the extent of Monroe's corruption. Warrants were issued for the consortium's directors. Judge Monroe himself was found on the 4th day, trying to cross into Mexico. The men he'd once served so faithfully had abandoned him, leaving him without money or protection. He was brought back to Bitter Creek in chains. The trial was brief, the evidence overwhelming, the verdict unanimous. On a clear morning a week after his capture, Judge Harlan Monroe stood on the gallows he'd ordered built for others. Governor Harrison read the sentence, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "For corruption, conspiracy to commit murder, and perversion of justice, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." Monroe's eyes found Eliza in the crowd, hatred burning in them until the end. She met his gaze without flinching, Blackwood's steady presence beside her. As the trapdoor opened and justice was finally served, Eliza felt no joy, only a solemn sense that a chapter had closed. The dead, her father, Blackwood's parents, his sister, and countless others, could rest easier now. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some went to the saloon to discuss what they'd witnessed. Others returned to homes and businesses, life gradually resuming its normal rhythm. Eliza and Blackwood walked in silence to their waiting carriage. "We could have that annulment now," he said quietly as they left town behind. The governor would arrange it discreetly. Eliza watched the landscape pass, considering her answer carefully. "Is that what you want?" "What I want," Blackwood replied, "is for you to have the choice that was taken from you." She turned to study his face, the face of a man who had pursued justice for 15 years, who had suffered and endured and never abandoned his purpose. A face she had come to know, to respect, and perhaps, in time, to love. "I choose to stay," she said simply. He didn't smile, that wasn't his way, but something in his eyes lightened, a shadow lifting after years of darkness. "Then we'll build something new," he said. Not from vengeance or necessity, but from choice. As they crested the hill that would take them home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the land. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but one they would face together, two orphans who had found, in the midst of loss and betrayal, an unexpected chance at healing. Behind them, the gallows stood empty against the darkening sky, a reminder that even in a world where justice came slowly, it came nonetheless. Total _char_count, 27,904.